Welcome, everyone. I'm Shelley Klein, president of the Generations After, and we've just been sharing a collection of photos sent in by many of you who have a special connection to today's program. These very moving photographs depict life in a number of different DP camps across Germany and Austria. And thank you so much to all of you who submitted those photos, and thank you to Ephraim for putting together the slideshow. We're going to show the slideshow again at the end of the program in case you missed any of it. We're so excited to present today's program about the role that displaced persons camps played in helping Shoah survivors restart their lives after the harrowing years prior to liberation. It's a topic that's, as it is to you, very close to my heart. Mine particularly because my parents met in one of the DP camps in the Wegscheid DP camp in Linz, and then were moved to another camp in Abelsberg, also in Linz, where I was born while our family was waiting for permission to come to the United States. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Kira Krager-Schneider, the Campus Outreach Program Officer at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Her research has focused on the relationships formed among Holocaust survivors, American occupiers, international aid workers, and Germans during the years 1945 to 1957. A link to her more extensive bio can be found in the chat, which should be there momentarily. While many of us were born in the DP camps or our parents met there, most of us, I find, really don't know all that much about how the camps were first organized or the dire issues that arose, how the people began to resurrect Jewish life in the DP camps, or how the camps launched the rebirth of the survivors. Dr. Krager-Schneider has a wealth of information to share with us about all of these issues and about life in the DP camps during that period. After the presentation, there'll be a Q&A, so please do enter your questions into the chat as they occur to you, and we will do our best to address them, as many of them as possible after the presentation. And now I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Kira Krager-Schneider.
Hi, everyone. Bear with me for 1 second while I share screen with you. I love those images so much, and I want to speak with many of you about the images that you submitted. So if you submitted them, please know. I'm going to try and follow up with you. I'd like to begin today's discussion by thanking Micheline Amir, Dina Hirsch, and Shelley Klein for inviting me to come and speak with you today about the lives of Holocaust survivors in post-war Germany. I would also like to thank Ephraim Katzir for all of the tech help, and to thank all of you for taking the time to join me here. I welcome questions at the end of this discussion, and I really look forward to being able to introduce you, to this topic, which is really near and dear to my heart. Before I dive in, I wanted to just give you a little bit of background information and some of the struggles that historians who work with displaced persons face on the daily when we are doing this work. So the first point that I want to make is about statistics. Record keeping time, obviously not the record keeping that we have today. So for some of these numbers, it's rough guessing at best. For some, we know a little bit more, but the constant movement of people, their family, and the movement of residents from one camp to another, combined with the misspelling of names and general data collection, means that there are no solidly reliable statistics for the number of DPs in the post-war period. This is especially true for Jewish DPs who were known to have traveled hundreds of miles if they heard a rumor about surviving families somewhere else in Europe. The statistics that I provide for you today are the most often used in the field. They're as close to the actual number as we've been able to get, but it could be off by hundreds, to be perfectly honest, in either direction. Additionally, I'll refer to these Shoah survivors and Allied Run centers as DPs throughout the entirety of this presentation. However, their title changed in 1951 when the West German government took control of last remaining Jews-only displaced person centers. At that time, these DPs became known as Heimatlose Ausländer, or stateless foreigners. But as I said, I will make a note of that when it happens in the presentation, but I will continue to refer to them as DPs because that is how they refer to themselves even after the change. Finally, just a note that I specialize in the study of Jewish displaced persons living in the American zone of occupied Germany, so the lecture will mainly focus on the experiences of that group. But I do want everyone to know that there were Jews-only displaced person centers in Italy and in Austria that were active simultaneously with those in Germany. And I will give you numbers and information relating to the larger issue of displaced persons in post-war Europe and share some maps with you so you can get an idea about the larger DP situation. So I will just jump right in. Okay, so can you guys hear me?
Yeah. Can you please unmute? Thank you.
According to this, I am unmuted. Hold on.
We can hear you now, but we lost you for a moment.
Okay, so I have no idea why that happened, but everybody can still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So that was a fact of post-war life in Europe. More than 30 million people were uprooted by Hitler's regime and by the Soviets between 1939 and 1945, mainly to achieve Hitler's rule of a pure racial state. Most of these displaced sought to return to their pre-war home countries of origin in the days, weeks, and months after the westward advance of the Red Army and German surrender in May of 1945. However, there was one group of individuals who did not want to return home. They were an estimated 12 million Volksdeutsche, or ethnic Germans, who uprooted themselves as the war shifted course for fear of retaliation. These individuals joined an estimated 8 million refugees who remained in occupied Germany and were classified as UN displaced persons, or UNDPs. Of the total DP population, only an estimated 2% were Shoah survivors in the summer of 1945. Allied and United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, efforts to resettle as many refugees in their pre-war homes as quickly as possible resulted in the repatriation of almost 7 million DPs in the summer and fall of 1945. This left roughly 1 million displaced persons living in Germany in early 1946, often referred to as the last million. The estimated 90,000 Jews liberated in Germany after living in hiding in privileged mixed marriages or after having survived concentration camps and death marches to the east became the responsibility of the four Allied forces in these respective zones and UNRWA. And you can see the various zones. This is a picture of Germany. The number of Jewish survivors, there were a further 65,000 Jews who lived in Austria and Italy in similar camps at the exact same time. The number of Jewish survivors in Germany dropped sharply in the first weeks after liberation, as tens of thousands died from the long-term effects of starvation and diseases such as tuberculosis, typhus, and cholera. Despite the best efforts of Allied doctors, some 4 out of every 10 liberated Jews died soon after their emancipation, leaving between 60 and 70,000 Shoah survivors in Germany in the late spring of 1945. Like other DPs, these Jews faced the choice of either remaining in Germany or attempting to return to their places of exile. More than 2/3 of the Jewish population chose to walk, board the few operating trains, or beg for rides on military lorries in an effort to get back to their former homes. It's important to remember that Europe was in total chaos at the end of the war, and while the Allies worked to recreate some semblance of order, this did not happen overnight. So the efforts to get to the east are really commendable, considering that most trains aren't running and people are walking hundreds of miles. The Allies had anticipated a refugee problem from early on in the war and had the foresight to prepare for the eventuality that they would need to care for these people after the war ended. 44 cooperating nations came together in November 1943 to create the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Dedicated to the aid of Allied European countries in need and the care of refugees under Allied control at the end of the war, these countries pledged to provide resources, supplies, and aid workers to help care for refugees and rebuild Western Europe in the wake of the war. The leaders of the organization declared their intent to care for the mental and physical needs of the refugees under its control. However, the actual plans decided between November 1943 and May 8, 1945, were woefully inaccurate for the situation these caregivers faced. They had been based on incorrect estimates relating to refugees and their needs, and were insufficient for the actual number of displaced persons in post-war Europe. Additionally, the caregivers sent over by UNRWA were wholly unprepared to deal with the traumatized masses they faced, and they could not understand why some UNDPs refused to return to their former home countries. It took little time for the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, or SHAEF, the combined Allied forces in control of occupation in Europe, to realize that UNRWA was overwhelmed by the task of caring for millions of displaced that they faced at war's end. Instead, it was the responsibility of the occupation governments in each zone and the troops on the ground to care for, house, supply, and find and feed Germany's displaced peoples. This meant that young men trained to fight and kill the enemy were essentially tasked with acting as social workers right after the war. Despite the aforementioned obstacles, UNRWA was able to take over control of DP camps in October 1945, and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee joined in the camps in late 1945. This led to a status quo of sorts in the camps, although they were not properly provisioned until 1947. The individuals who remained in occupied Germany, Austria, and Italy originally lived in what were known as mixed camps. These survivors demanded recognition as Jews, as a separate nationality. Ignoring their pleas, the Americans, British, and French separated all DPs into national groups regardless of their war experiences, and forced Jewish survivors to live with non-Jewish DPs who had subscribed to virulent anti-Semitism, were collaborators, and on occasion Nazis. Further complicating the situation were major food and clothing shortages that persisted until 1947. And you can see these people are being resettled and they're still wearing their concentration camp uniforms. First contact with Shoah survivors left liberating soldiers and UNRWA aid workers grappling with feelings of disbelief, distress, and disgust at the overwhelming evidence of death and destruction. Makeshift hospital rooms were filled with bunks of patients on the brink of death, and starvation continued to plague these victims. The care of emaciated, ill, and injured survivors was amongst the highest priorities facing Allied troops. Initially treated by Allied doctors and members of the Red Cross on site, often in concentration camp infirmaries, survivors needed more care than could be provided to them. The severe medical situation led members of SHAEF to requisition hospitals and sanatoria to attend to those needing long-term medical help. Finding appropriate facilities was only one issue that SHAEF faced. With too few qualified, capable medical professionals among Allied military forces and the Red Cross in Germany, SHAEF looked for other means to meet survivors' medical needs, and soon required German doctors and nurses to come care for the very people their country had tried to eradicate. St. Ottilian Hospital, located in Emming, Germany, opened to Shoah survivors in late April 1945. The majority of its patients came from the Kaufering concentration camp, a subcamp of Dachau. Its medical staff largely consisted of Germans who had worked in the facility when it operated as a military hospital before spring 1945. This was also the case in the Gauting Sanatorium, one of the largest institutions in southern Germany, which had acted as a Wehrmacht hospital during the war and employed many convinced Nazis. The sanatorium began admitting Shoah survivors in summer 1945, housing more than 600 patients at its peak. Most had tuberculosis, rampant throughout post-war Europe, and remained in Gauting until they were deemed fully recovered, at which point they were resettled in neighboring displaced persons centers. The Allies requisitioned hundreds of facilities like St. Ottilian and Gauting throughout Germany and co-opted the staff to treat surviving Jews. Survivors healthy enough for release and those with chronic but not life-threatening or contagious illnesses were treated at hospitals in the DP camps, such as the one located in Fahrenwald. The DPs living in centers without medical facilities were seen by doctors and nurses who came to the camps on regular rotations, employed by UNRWA and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or they were seen by German doctors in neighboring towns. Although many Shoah survivors in Germany required medical care upon liberation, most were well enough to settle outside of concentration camps in DP centers as soon as housing became available. Some became squad waiting directions on where they should go after liberation, but housing shortages plagued the Office of the Military Government US, or OMGIS, for years. Western Allied bombing campaigns in 1944 and 1945 left entire German cities in rubble, and an estimated 25 million Germans homeless. Finding adequate housing for Shoah survivors was neither a priority nor an easy task for OMGIS. Occupation troops were forced to build viable housing facilities. Barracks, Hitler Youth Academies, lean-tos, and complexes built to house voluntary workers and their families during the war became sites for DP centers. There was often one bathroom for several families, and men and women lived together. These individuals often shared a mess hall. These buildings were initially behind barbed wire and encircled by armed guards because General George S. Patton, the military officer in charge of southern Bavaria, where the largest concentration of Jewish DPs lived, was anti-Semitic and worried about the safety of Germans at the hands of survivors. Let's all take a moment to think about that. Patton feared that persecuted Jews would murder, quote, good Germans, and so continued to keep DPs captive. And as you can see from this quote that came from September 1945, Patton recorded in his diary, quote, evidently the virus started by Morgenthau and Baruch of a Semitic revenge against all Germans is still working. Harrison and his ilk believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not, and this applies particularly to Jews who are lower than animals. News about the dire situation of Shoah survivors in the American zone of occupation reached President Harry S. Truman in summer 1945. After deliberation and pressure from American Jewish communities, Truman agreed to send an American commission under the direction of Earl G. Harrison to evaluate the situation. Harrison arrived in Germany in June 1945 to, quote, ascertain the needs of the stateless and non-repatriatables, particularly Jews among the displaced persons in Germany, and to what extent those needs are being provided at present by military authorities, international and national private organizations, end quote. The delegation's published findings, subsequently known as the Harrison Report, propelled OMGIS to make sweeping changes to how Jewish survivors in the American zone were treated. These included the designation of several Jews-only displaced person centers, an increase in the amount of food allotted to Jewish survivors, an American push to open the gates of Palestine, and Jews recognized as their own national group. I think it's important to note that none of these changes were implemented in any other zone, mainly for political reasons, which we can talk about at the end. President Truman directed immediate changes in the care, control, and treatment of Jewish displaced persons, even before the Harrison Report recommendations had been formally issued. He ordered General Eisenhower, in his capacity as military governor of the U.S. zone of occupation, to improve the conditions of the DPs. Formally taking on this task on August 10, 1945, Eisenhower notified the State Department that any Jewish displaced person who did not wish to be repatriated would be moved into a Jews-only camp. These camps were run by UNRWA with the help of outside Jewish aid organizations. And the Jewish aid organizations worked directly with the Jews to find out what it was they needed to survive. Eisenhower also ordered all of his officers to requisition any supplies Germans needed to raise the standard of living in the camps to the level of individuals living outside the centers. He required his senior officers to visit the camps regularly, and he approved the suggestion of Rabbi Stephen Weiss, an advisor to the president on post-war refugee affairs, to appoint a Jewish advisor to the United States European Command, an intermediary who would meet with the DPs and report their needs and concerns to OMGIS. Finally, Eisenhower removed the armed guards from the Jews-only camps and replaced them with internal security composed entirely of Jewish police officers under OMGIS's control. While repatriation, resettlement, and reintegration were possibilities for Jews from Western Europe, this was rarely the case for Jews from the East, who continued to meet with extreme and often violent anti-Semitism upon their attempted return. The Kielce pogrom in July 1946 resulted in the murder of 42 Jewish Holocaust survivors and prompted many Jews who had tried to rebuild their lives in the East to emigrate westward. The arrival of these Jews, known as infiltrees, increased the DP population to 250,000 in the Allied zones of occupation. Most of these Jews had lived out a wartime existence in the furthest reaches of the Soviet Union. The Office of the Military Government US was willing to allow some 150,000 of these Jews into its zone and accepted responsibility for housing them. The infiltrees were not initially granted DP status. It took several months of overcrowding and waiting before the infiltrees were also designated as DPs and joined the million Jewish and non-Jewish DPs in Germany seeking UNRWA care. With the influx of these mainly Polish Jews came intact families with children and elderly members and brought the number of Jewish DPs to 20% of the DP population. In one of history's greatest ironies, Germany became a safe haven for many Shoah survivors. Allied occupation, America's stand against the British closure of Palestine to Jewish immigration, and the acknowledgement of Jews as a separate national group with special needs, combined with laws against the expression of anti-Semitism, made West Germany the best place to temporarily wait for resettlement. This westward migration in the summer and fall of 1946, combined with the estimated 36,000 Jews who had chosen to remain in Germany upon their liberation and the thousands too ill to attempt to return to their pre-war homes, presented the Allies and UNRWA with a task they had not anticipated and were unprepared to tackle. It was clear to Jewish DPs, the three Western Allied powers, and the international aid organizations caring for survivors that the DP camp system in Germany was temporary. However, no immigration solutions presented themselves, and very few survivors were resettled in the three first post-war years. When American surveys asked survivors about their resettlement hopes, the response was almost universally Palestine as their first choice for immigration. Their second choice was the crematoria, because all of these survivors agreed that there was a need for a Jewish state, and that might be the only place where the Jews could be safe. However, the British continued to keep strict immigration laws in place, going as far as to imprison undocumented immigrants in concentration camps on the island of Cyprus. Additionally, the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, and several countries in South America continued to be largely closed to this population. Aid workers often described the DPs as idle, listless, and lazy, which is part of the reason that they did not appear to be attractive immigrants. However, my research actually showed quite the opposite. The camps were thriving centers of activity with businesses, restaurants, schools, training programs, politics, and culture. DPs who possessed the ability to speak more than one language, secretaries, firefighters, police, and skilled maintenance workers were employed by UNRWA and the JDC in the camps. Each center held elections, and a representative body in the US and the British zones relayed the needs, desires, and aspirations of this group of the military government. Overseeing their welfare, there was a DP university in Munich for survivors who wanted to get a college education, and Germans came to the camp to teach children how to do ballet and art and to clean houses and nurse babies. However, many DPs were unemployed. As a collective, they refused, rightfully enough, to clean up the damage of the war in the cities surrounding their centers. German industry was at a relative standstill, and German businesses refused to hire Jews to work in their shops. I want to note that while I have been talking about DPs as a homogeneous group, every single person's experience was obviously different, and we can't group them in and say that they were lazy because they did not work. The Jewish DP centers acted as insular communities for 12 years of their existence in Germany and allowed for Jewish life to resume within the gates. The Jews were separated from German society physically and legally, which gave them a chance to begin again. Just to give you a bit of an idea about who made up this population in the immediate post-war period, the majority of DPs were young men, usually between the ages of 15 and 30. In the case of the Lawnsburg DP camp, the largest in the American zone, only 5% of the camp residents were between the ages of 5 and 14. So really, it was the 15 to 45 category. Not very many old people or young people survived. Centers that were built to house 2,000 people usually held between 4 and 5,000 DPs, and 8 to 10 strangers often shared a single room, with 2 to 3 family units, which were fairly rare in the immediate post-war period, sharing an apartment. Often men, women, and single strangers were forced to live together, and marriages took place within days of liberation. These events were rarely between lovers reunited after the war. Instead, they were among survivors who'd only met in the DP centers and wanted to rebuild their families that were stolen from them during the war. These marriages were called Hitler marriages because the involved parties were thrust together in camps with no surviving loved ones to help them navigate their futures. One survivor noted, quote, "I was alone, he was alone. We thought together maybe we would be half as alone," end quote. Some DPs admit to marrying quickly because it afforded them more private quarters with fewer residents sharing their room. Now, I would be remiss if I did not also note that many DPs came of age during the Shoah, and sex was also a major factor that led to marriage. So I'm sure you guys all know what happens after marriage and sex. Of course, babies. And I saw some of these beautiful images in the beginning. Couples work to get pregnant as quickly as possible. The desire to recreate family motivated many, but many survivors had also been victims of brutal scientific testing and did not know what had been done to them. Knowledge of forced sterilizations performed in camps led many women to believe they may have been victims of these procedures. Starvation and ill health halted many women's menstrual cycles, and the need to prove to themselves that they were still women and could procreate was essential to their well-being. Also, having children was seen as a form of revenge against Hitler and the Nazis. And in an ironic turn, the Jewish birth rate in Germany in the first 2 post-war years was the highest Jewish birth rate anywhere in the world. Aspect of life in the camps had a religious element. In the case of the Fahrenwald displaced persons camp, they had 6 different synagogues so that any level of religiosity could be met. All of the holidays were celebrated in the DP centers. This doesn't mean that everyone had to participate, but that if you wanted to, there was some kind of a celebration happening. All the major camps had yeshivot, and some of the larger camps also offered Beth Israel schools for girls. Religious leaders of every type could be found in these centers after 1946 with the influx because more rabbis had survived in the Soviet Union than had survived in Allied and occupied Western Europe. It was really important to many Jews to rebuild and reconnect with their Jewishness after the war. There was also a huge push to make life in DP centers mirror life outside of those centers and to work to make sure that children had fun and simple living situations within the DP camps. Now, this was difficult in several different ways. How does one set up schools and make people feel comfortable with so many shared languages? While Yiddish was the central language in the centers, many of the center's leaders pushed for Hebrew to be the spoken language to prepare people for their future lives in Palestine. Additionally, few resources remained intact for classroom use, and educators were singled out for murder upon arrival at death camps. Now, despite this, the Jewish GPs were able to overcome these obstacles. They opened schools, and people were settled into the centers, and the school system grew as more children were added to the DP population. There were also every single displaced person center, if they were large enough, had their own newspaper. And people in the centers would subscribe to papers in other centers and in other zones so that they could keep up to date on the Jewish news in Europe. Orchestras formed in the days after liberation, and this particular orchestra would go around and perform to ill people in hospitals, but also they were hired out as entertainment for the troops and visiting dignitaries. Theater was another important aspect of life in the DP centers, and it was often used as a way of processing mental trauma and working through the past. Politics, as I mentioned, with the elections, were incredibly important to survivors. The two central groups within an EDP camp were the Zionists and the Bundists, and there was a lot of conflict between the two groups. The Zionists were often beating up the Bundists, and it was because the Bundists argued that the Jews should return to their former home countries and carry out a socialist revolution there, whereas the Zionists argued that the only place for the Jews was in Palestine. Within the Zionist groups, there were several types of Zionism. And so a lot of times the vote was really broken down. There were some Zionists who wanted to have a socialist government, others who wanted different forms of government. And the Zionists couldn't agree on which borders should be in place for the Yishuv in Palestine. The Yishuv in Palestine worked with UNRWA to establish kibbutzim, or kibbutzes, outside of several larger camps in the US zone. These were often on farms that had been taken from prominent Nazis. So it was a form of revenge, but also a way to prepare for his future lives in Palestine. These kibbutzim acted as surrogate families and kept younger orphans from getting into trouble. When a kibbutz was moved to Israel, the entirety of the kibbutz was moved. So everyone in the kibbutz received a visa. They were all taken to Israel, where they reestablished their kibbutzim. Finally, training programs were set up to teach people for their future lives abroad. These included classes for watchmaking, tailoring, nursing, beauty techniques, auto maintenance, dental, and language classes. The UN Declaration to Divide Palestine in 1947 and the creation of the State of Israel in May 1948 boosted the spirits of many DPs who believed their time in camps had finally come to an end. However, in a meeting on May 4th, 1948, just days before the establishment of Israel, several American Jewish leaders, as well as many prominent officials from the Yishuv, came together to discuss the resettlement of Jewish DPs. At this meeting, Nahum Goldman of the Jewish Agency noted that the survivors were not, quote, the human material Eretz Yisrael needed, end quote. Although the creation of the State of Israel gave Jews a viable immigration option, it did not solve the DP problem in occupied Germany. The immediate outbreak of war in Israel, combined with the logistical issues that accompany mass immigration, made resettlement incredibly difficult. So much so that it took until 1952 for the majority of the Jews who would settle in Israel to make it to Israel and settle there. It was not until 1955 that Israel began accepting elderly, infirm, and family units to the country in large numbers. Well, Israel was universally declared the most sought-after site of immigration by and for survivors. The country that took the highest number of DPs, it was not the only location where Jewish DPs wished to emigrate, despite what they said on their surveys. For many, the United States acted as a beacon of hope for a new life away from the accursed soil of Europe. However, the US remained largely closed to Jewish immigration until 1950. President Harry S. Truman issued the Truman Directive in December 1945, which required that existing immigration quotas left unfilled by the war be designated for displaced persons. The directive did not lead to increased immigration quotas to the United States, and only an estimated 17,000 Jewish DPs qualified for U.S. immigration between 1946 and 1947. Like the United States, Canada, Australia, Argentina, South America, and several other countries, the U.S. just remained closed to Jewish DPs. This changed in the U.S. in June 1948 when Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act, which drastically increased immigration for DPs to the U.S. By mortgaging future visas for use in the contemporary moment. However, the first iteration of the law was written to exclude most Jews, and the act was not amended until 1950. The Truman Directive, a DP Act, allowed somewhere around 80,000 Jewish DPs to finally immigrate to the United States by 1958. Canada also accepted between 16,000 and 20,000 Jewish DPs during this period. Within Europe, Belgium took about 8,000 Jewish DPs, and France admitted a further 2,000. Finally, an estimated 5,000 Jewish DPs settled in South Africa and Latin America. Along with these departing DPs went their former leadership, resulting in the dismantling of several DP organizations. The years between 1948 and 1952 are referred to by DP scholars as the Great Postwar Immigration, and resulted in the resettlement of all but an estimated 2,000 Shoah survivors who were referred to as the, quote, hardcore. They were considered unattractive immigrants by immigration boards in several countries because of age, ill health, and moral turpitude. Although countries such as Israel would begin accepting these DPs after 1955, many of the hardcore refused to be resettled in any country other than the United States, which remained, of course, close to those who fell in the above-mentioned categories. The quickly diminishing number of DPs led to the consolidation of DP centers, finally resulting in one remaining camp by 1953, Fahrenwald. Just as mass immigration and DP consolidation were occurring, so too was the push by the Federal Republic of Germany and the United States to transfer control over all remaining DPs to the newly formed West German government in the hopes of eventually closing all DP centers. The transfer took place on December 1st, 1951, much to the chagrin of the remaining Jewish DPs who vowed never again to be under the control of their former oppressors who had murdered their families. The status of the DPs changed with the transfer of control from displaced persons under American jurisdiction to Heimatlose Ausländer, or stateless foreigners, under West Germans. With this change in status came many of the rights and responsibilities afforded to German citizens. Additionally, Jewish survivors lost their protected status under the Americans, which guaranteed that German police could not enter Jewish centers and that Jews would be tried by American military courts and not in the German legal system. For their part, the German authorities met the calls and demands set forth for them by the Office of the U.S. High Commissioner of Germany and the JDC, and daily life was no worse under German control than it had been under that of the International Refugee Organization, which was the successor of UNRWA. The Bavarian government, which was responsible for the operations of Fahrenwald, worked hard to keep the stateless Jews in clean, well-kept facilities with adequate rations and provided immigration and integration grants for those who qualified. Although the German federal government wanted to close the remaining centers for DPs as quickly as possible, it was willing to work with the JDC and the Central Council of Jews in Germany to try to resettle as many Jews abroad as possible. However, nearly 6 years after securing power from the United States by commission, the West German government still found itself caring for more than 1,000 Jewish DPs who either did not qualify for immigration or refused to resettle outside of the camps. The fact that many DPs were ineligible for immigration meant that the situation in Germany remained at a standstill, occasionally punctuated by conflict. Although the creation of the State of Israel had reignited hope for the future resettlement among many Shoah survivors who remained in Germany, it took less than a year before a new, unexpected wave of Jews began to trickle into the country and settle DP camps, mainly in Faro. These individuals had formerly been DPs, but had been resettled abroad in North and South America, Australia, and especially Israel. In a painfully ironic turn, they had now left their new homeland to cross illegally into Germany on passports marked, quote, not for use in Germany, demanding the return of their status as stateless people and the resettlement in a more favorable country than the one from where they had come. The returners cited several reasons for leaving Israel, including the climate, war, ill health, separation from family members, and their inability to adapt to the high lifestyle. The prospect of restitution also drew a significant number back to Germany, as the compensation negotiations between the Adenauer government and the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany were finally settled in 1952. Residents in Germany made it easier for those seeking restitution to secure these funds. Although the Israeli returners gave several different reasons for their return, they all agreed that they had come back to Europe to find what they could not get in Israel: medical care, viable business opportunities, and a chance to emigrate elsewhere. The status of the first Israeli returners to Germany fell into a gray zone as they arrived in the country on passports marked invalid for travel to Germany, with valid visas to enter Germany issued by consulates and embassies in Rome and Paris. Additionally, the returnees who had emigrated after 1949 and entered Germany after the spring of 1951 did so under the provisions specified in the 1951 law on the legal status of stateless foreigners. This law allowed stateless individuals who had formerly lived in Germany to return to the country within 2 years of their departure. The small group of returnees initially caused very little concern. However, the quick surge in their numbers began to cause problems in southern Bavaria, especially in Fahrenwald. There were an estimated 418 returners living in the camp in June 1952, despite the official closure of the center to newcomers. This number grew to around 800 by August of 1953 and continued to climb. By the end of 1953, some 3,500 returnees had made their way through Fehrenwald, sparking a sense of urgency among both JDC and authorities from the Bavarian government, anxious to prevent a further influx and to close the last remaining center. The flow of returnees increased so rapidly in the early 1950s that more entered Camp Fehrenwald every month than the number of Jews emigrating out. Fehrenwald's population was 1,800 in October 1952, of which an estimated 50% were returnees. There was no existing protocol in place in Germany to deal with this embarrassing population because no one had ever anticipated that any of them would return to the country of their former oppressors. In a JDC report from August 2, 1952, the JDC country director for Germany noted the returnees with whom he had met emphasized that they, quote, did not recognize that they were Israeli nationals, end quote. Instead, these chosrim, or returners as they called themselves, demanded the return of their papers that had identified them as stateless. The IRO and later the West German government, as well as the Jewish aid organizations, considered these returnees nationals of the countries they had left, regardless of the claims made by the returnees themselves. Discussions over the care of the returnee population took place among every group involved in the maintenance of the Jewish DPs. While the Bavarian government and JDC had disavowed any responsibility for the returners as they had already paid to have this group resettled, both groups begrudgingly admitted that they would help care for hardcore cases on an individual basis. Throughout the 1950s, JDC became involved in several aspects of the returnee issue, while the local Bavarian government helped provide care for those individuals who desperately needed it. In the end, the majority of the returnees were resettled in Israel, and a handful of them were able to secure immigration visas to new countries, although as a whole, the group was known to be troublemakers. The West German government worked with the JDC officials and the Central Council of Jews in Germany to develop a plausible plan to resettle the DPs in Fehrenwald who could not emigrate and would remain in Germany, many of whom had suffered from tuberculosis and were ineligible for emigration anywhere except Israel. For their part, German authorities pledged to match the funding provided by JDC and the Claims Conference to resettle the last of the hardcore Jews. Additionally, the German government stated that it would secure housing and employment opportunities for those who decided to remain in the country, while also providing institutional assistance for those too sick to live without constant care. Unfortunately, the German housing and economic crisis made it impossible to keep the promise in a timely manner. While the German economy began to recover in the 1950s, cities such as Munich, which took the majority of Fehrenwald's DPs, could not rebuild housing fast enough to replace those destroyed during the war. The severity of the situation is illustrated in late 1953 when the West German government agreed to pay for housing units for 500 camp residents at a time when 1,300 waited to be resettled. Housing shortages combined with the fact that the Jews in Fehrenwald were so hesitant to leave the camp meant that the resettlement process was slow at best. Just under 1,000 DPs remained in Fehrenwald in 1954, but this number dropped to 416 in April of that year. The majority of the last remaining DPs had begrudgingly agreed to settle in West Germany. The Jews who had signed up for resettlement in Germany clamored to move to their new homes, not because they wanted to leave Fehrenwald, which continued to be considered a safe community, because they did not want to be left with nowhere else to go. The continued housing shortages meant that more Jews signed up to leave than there was actual housing available. This situation further worsened when the Catholic Settlements Works and the Archdiocese of Munich-Freising, the center's owner since 1955, began to take over parts of the Fehrenwald DP camp and make renovations. Many social and training programs in Fehrenwald at this time stopped operating, signaling the center's impending closure, at which point the remaining DPs started to panic about their resettlement. Although 150 DPs were resettled in Munich, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Wiesbaden in February 1956, resettlement slowed down in the spring. In April 1956, the JDC estimated that it would be able to resettle the majority of the remaining camp residents over the following 2 months. However, almost no one left the center during that period. In total, in April, only 24 individuals were resettled. The liquidation of Camp Fehrenwald happened quickly once integration began in fall of 1956. In the days leading to the closure of Fahrenwald, 75 Jews who had called the camp home for 12 years exited its gates, bringing with them the end of the post-Hitler epoch. The last residents of Fahrenwald left the center on February 28, 1957, and many of these last DPs had spent 17 years in camps, both during the Shoah and after the end of World War II. Their departure was accompanied by speeches from West German officials, JDC, and the Hayes, and all marking the monumental nature of the day. There would be no big victory celebration by JDC or the Ministry of the Interior, for, as Theodore Feder, a director of JDC, noted, this would not, quote, make a good impression on the Fernwalders who still have to remain and live in Germany, end quote. In his final report on Fernwald, Charles Jordan, JDC Director General for Overseas Operations, noted, quote, when human dignity and self-respect have been so thoroughly destroyed as was theirs, it takes many years of normal and independent living to restore them, end quote. Everyone involved in the care and control of Jewish survivors in Germany hoped the closing of Fahrenwald would bring with it the chance for these displaced Jews to begin their lives anew. Many of the resettled Jews said that their lives in Germany were fine, but they still hoped that they could resettle abroad in the future. Either way, the DP era provided Shoah survivors a safe haven in the unlikeliest place imaginable, Germany. And Fahrenwald will celebrate its 80th anniversary this October. There's so much more that I can share with you today, or share with you, but I can't do it today. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing, my mind is trying to absorb all the information that you have imparted. I thought I knew a lot about my parents' experiences, and as you say, each DP had a unique experience. I think my parents was more on the positive side. But again, that was absolutely fantastic. I'll turn it over now to one of our program committee members, Rachel Miller, to handle the Q&A for us. Thank you again. Over to you, Rachel.
Okay, thank you. We have such a range of questions. I think so many people recognize them, their family stories. So I'd like to go through them carefully. Quentin says, the photos I've seen of myself in the DP camp in Germany have me very well dressed. How did that happen?
Yeah, so usually children were actually extremely well dressed in the post-war period, unlike their parents who were initially given one outfit. And that is because, first of all, parents really wanted to show their children off. So they would trade items that they received in their care packages for clothing that was made by their German neighbors. Also, the JDC provided some clothing for children, and it was easier to find nice children's clothing than it was to find clothing for adults. So a lot of time when you look at those images, the babies and the small children are dressed very, very well. And it is because the Jewish DPs have access to that through different means that aren't necessarily available for adults.
Thank you. Okay, from Paul, I hope you will talk about the connection of the DP camps to Aliyah Bet in 1946 to 48.
Yes, I can definitely address that. So the Aliyah Bet is the clandestine movement of individuals from their homes, if they tried to resettle, or from the DP centers, through mainly the American zone of occupation, to boats that would take them to pre-state Palestine. And the process was actually run by a number of people who came from the Jewish settlement in Palestine known as the Yishuv. And sometimes they were actually British military soldiers, Jewish British military units, and they would help bring people across borders. They would provide funds, they would provide scouts, they would provide trucks, and they would bring people mainly into the American zone because the American zone was so much more sympathetic to the Jewish cause than was the case in the British zone. Italy was a known center for DPs going to Palestine through illegal means. And actually to the point where the British asked the Americans to really crack down on the movement of those DPs from Italy onto boats directly to Palestine. But you do see that these movements are going through a lot of southern Bavaria. It's a further trek for them. In the case of Italy, you're right there on the coast for most of these people. But you have individuals that came in, they'd stay for a bit as a group, and then they would take their opportunity to get on a boat and go. And the well-known example, of course, is the Exodus ship that was stopped and turned around. And those individuals were either brought back to their DP centers or they were housed in France, depending on what the available spaces were.
Okay. Shelley Heller asks if you could repeat the name of the sanatorium in Fahrenwald.
Yeah, it's Gauting, Gauting.
Wait, I'm writing that down too. Gauting. Okay. And is this where my mother likely spent 6 months recovering from TB? She specifically recalled anti-Semitic nurses happily telling her that every medical procedure she had to undergo would hurt.
It's very well possible. Gauting served a number of the DP centers in southern Bavaria. It's actually like in a monastery. It's quite beautiful. But a number of Jews were sent directly there because they had tuberculosis. They went through the procedures to get over tuberculosis. And most of the time, if you were in Gauting and you were released, you either went to Feldafing or you went to Fahrenwald. So if your mother was in a facility and ended up in one of those camps, most likely she was at Gauting.
Okay, Joseph, I was born in a DP camp in Berlin in 47. My cousin Laura Magnus has long been affiliated with the Holocaust Museum. I'm not going to stay, and she asks if we're going to have a recording. So this is a good chance to remind everybody that if they missed anything, came in late, we will be sending out recordings. Let's see. We have Simon telling us he was born in Fahrenwald in 53. So he was, from what you explained, pretty late in the game.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
curious to know if his parents were elderly or maybe they'd come out of that tubercular period. We can always talk about it later, but
okay.
always intrigued when people are born in the camp in the 1950s.
Okay, Shimon, if you're there, you can let us know your parents' age. Okay, many of the pictures submitted, Rita Rubenstein's family include me, and in case anybody recognizes Ada's picture, she sends us her email address. Please contact her.
It's in
Take
the
a look
chat.
at
Take a look at the chat.
Yeah, take a look at the chat to see that one. Please list any books or articles on DP camps from Sam.
So I can definitely get a bibliography over that you guys can share with the audience if they'd like to learn more.
That would be great. Maybe we could include it when we send our um, recording. Oof.
So I can address the one that's the I about the Stuttgart incident.
Uh-huh.
So he is correct. Actually, the survivor had just the night before been reunited with his wife and child. And it was believed that there was black market activity happening in the DP center, and the German police came in, and then unfortunately they killed the Holocaust survivor. And from that date on, German police were not allowed to enter displaced person centers until Germany took over control of those centers. And that is what motivated the American government to say that there were a couple of restrictions. So they couldn't go into the camps. If you were outside of the camp and you committed a crime, you couldn't be held in a German jail. They actually created DP prisons to keep the criminals separate. A German police officer could not hold you for more than 25 minutes, I believe. They had to contact the American police, and then your trial was heard in a military court rather than in the German legal system. So after the Stuttgart incident, Jewish DPs from that period in 45 until 51 essentially live outside of the legal system in Germany.
Okay. Related question from Quentin. What was the role of Hayas in working with, if there was one, working with the DPs?
Yeah, so the JDC is the organization that's like directly in the camp, but they are part of a larger organization that is many American Jewish organizations working together. And so a lot of their funds come from other organizations, and their supplies come from a number of other organizations. And Highest was also really involved in resettlement efforts. So it may be the JDC that pays for your ticket, but it's going to be Highest and the Office for New Americans that helps you get resettled. It's going to be Highest who helps you if you're sent to somewhere in the middle of America, they're going to help you figure out if you can get a job, who's going to kind of care for you in that community. So Highest is very, very involved in the actual DP experience.
Okay. Anat asks if you can elaborate on the Harrison report and the role of the U.S. soldier Robert Hilliard and the thousands of letters he wrote about the inadequate and sometimes hard treatment of survivors by the U.S. Army.
Yeah, definitely. So I glossed over because I would love to include more, but we only had 45 minutes. I glossed over how Harrison ends up getting there. So what happens is that soldiers are sending letters home, mainly Jewish soldiers. They're sending letters home to their family and to their synagogues, talking about these conditions in Jewish displaced persons camps or mixed camps at the time. And really Morgenthau is very, very involved because he's the one that Jews are coming to. He's a Jewish figure in the government that Jewish communities are coming to and saying, look, we can't be treating Holocaust survivors like this. Look at this letter that I received from my son who's abroad. What can we do? And Morgenthau really pushes to have the Harrison Commission go and evaluate what is happening. And Truman really doesn't, from everything that I've seen, he really doesn't care very much about how the Jews are being treated, but he does care about Jewish constituents. So when Morgenthau comes to him and says, we need to send a commission, Truman agrees, but Truman's not really involved in making all of that happen. They decide on Earl G. Harrison because he had been involved in a number of refugee issues during the war period. He's a very sympathetic individual, but he knew how to work within the government, and he had been involved with refugees. And he's actually a lawyer, and he's the dean of the Pennsylvania Law School at the time that he gets sent over. He's no longer working with the government. And he goes over and he's on a very sanitary, sterilized itinerary where he's going to all of the best DP centers and seeing how well DPs are being cared for. And in a sense, he's kind of kidnapped by a wonderful character, Rabbi Abraham Klausner, who was a young GI and kind of goes AWOL to take care of DPs. And when he gets off of the plane, Klausner comes to him and says, look, they've given you this itinerary, but if you really want to see how Jews are being treated, you need to come with me. And they go to the centers that have the largest number of Jews, which are often really run down. They're unhygienic. There's not enough food for individuals. And he goes from camp to camp meeting with Jews and sees how they're actually being treated. And in many ways, according to the military, the Jews are being treated just fine because they're receiving the same caloric intake and the same amount of space and the same amount of clothing as a US soldier would get. So, but they're not taking into account the fact that survivors have just lived through years of trauma and starvation and disease, and they actually need better care. And Harrison, and many people will agree that Harrison, when he wrote his report, he over exaggerates how horrible everything is, but he has to do that in order to get the Americans to do anything. So that one quote that I put up, that is not even the worst quote that he has in the Harrison report about the treatment of treatment of Jewish Holocaust survivors by Americans. And the report does exactly what it's supposed to do. He gives Truman a copy in July and it gets published in September. But by the time that it is published, they've already made all of these changes to improve the lives of Jews in that center. So really the Harrison report is a turning point. The letters that motivate it really pushed for people to look at how Jews were being treated by Americans in the post-war.
I have to tell you, I've never seen so many questions in all the time we were doing this, and we could go on and on. I'm going to have to I'm gonna have to just look for one last one.
Well, or
Could
maybe
you,
two if they're not too
do we
lengthy.
have enough time for two? Okay. Could you address the status of sanatoriums and orphanages? Were they separate from DP camps or considered DP camps? I like that one because I was living in a guest house. My father was in a sanatorium, and I never lived in one of those buildings, and I never thought I was in part of a DP camp. So I'm curious what you have to say about that question.
Yeah, so one of the first slides that I showed you were individuals who qualified and as DPs, as UNDPs. If you fit into that category, which most Holocaust survivors did, then you were a UNDP regardless of where you were. And actually, the DP centers could be set up anywhere. So sometimes it was a handful of apartments in an apartment building, and that was a DP camp, even though it wasn't this traditional camp that we think of. So children in orphanages and people in sanatoria were considered DPs, regardless of where they lived. And a lot of those individuals end up, not as much in the case of children, but with the sanatoria, they go into a DP camp after. But in the case of Gauting, they have a DP radio station and a DP newsletter. So you can tell that the people in that area understand themselves as DPs, and that the official governments that are taking care of them understand them as DPs. In the case of children, I have done some research on Kloster Indersdorf, which was a very large orphanage for children, and that is considered a DP center. So if you had a CM1 card, you were a DP, whether you lived in a camp or not. And if you were not living on the economy in an apartment that you set up for yourself, you're a DP. And most likely where you're living is a DP center.
Okay, and my aunt in an orphanage is also in a DP,
Yes.
what you're telling me. So I think a lot of us probably have roots to DP camps that we didn't know about. Thanks to you, we do. I have one last question that was sent in before we met. But while I'm asking it, everybody take a look at the chats because so many people wrote to us to share their experience, their own experiences, and we can't, unfortunately, talk about them all.
Yes, and I would love to see the chat, and I can answer questions after the fact as well.
Amazing. How many people went back to their home countries versus different countries?
So initially, 2/3 of the survivor population attempts to return to their former countries.
Okay.
Number of individuals who end up in a DP center, which is it's usually not Germans or Austrians. Their numbers are really, really small. They end up reintegrating or remaining away from Europe if they had fled. But the majority of DPs who are in a DP camp, 95% of them, maybe even higher, end up going to a different country. They are in a DP camp because their country of origin is no longer a place that they can go to or a place that they want to return to. And a lot of DPs argued that Europe had become a cemetery for them because everywhere they looked, there had been so much death and destruction. They had no idea where their family members were buried. They didn't want to stay in Europe after the war. So you have a little bit of movement. So for example, Norway and Belgium end up taking a handful of people who have tuberculosis. They argue that it is cheaper to get someone over tuberculosis than it is to raise a child to adulthood. So you have some people that are brought in because the conditions are better, the sanatoria better, but the majority of people end up emigrating elsewhere.
I see. Okay, well, thank you so much. I think that's all the time we have, and I'm going to have to turn you back to Shelley.
Okay,
Just
thank
wonderful.
you, Rachel. We're going to close the program with another replaying of the slideshow we played at the very beginning of the photos everybody sent in. But before we do that, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank our special guest, Dr. Rachel Crago-Schneider, as well as our the Generations After Program Committee, and our tech guru, Ephraim Katzir, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. As was mentioned before, everyone who registered for the program will receive a link to the recording, which will be on our YouTube channel, and you'll get that link in a few days. And we'll try to also include that list of books from Dr. Crago-Schneider. I believe the recording is going to have closed captioning as well. We would also very much appreciate your completing a very brief survey about today's program to aid us in developing future programs. I believe the link should be in the chat. If not now, it should be in momentarily. If you're a current member, thank you. If you'd like to become a new member or renew your membership, please do join. Remember that only paid up members can participate in the Speakers Bureau, the book group, and our writing groups. And your dues also contribute to survivor welfare and the continuation of the Remember a Child program and programs such as today's wonderful program. We're also happy to receive a one-time donation for this free program. So please visit our website at genafterdc.org to learn more. And thank you for participating today. Enjoy the slideshow again and the rest of your afternoon.